Hey now, and welcome to the City Off Campus podcast with your two favorite hosts, Sammy Summerfeld and Jack McFarland. We've got a special guest today. We've got Bobby Marks, who is the ESPN NBA front office insider. How's everything going with you today?
I'm good, guys. How are you? Hope you guys are doing well and staying safe.
Yeah, we're doing great. To kick off the podcast, my first question for you is, how did you get into professional basketball and who kind of gave you your first start?
Well, my first start came as an intern back in 1995, and it was really just because I needed to graduate. That's how it all started, where I was 6 credits short. I was able to walk with my class, but I needed an internship to kind of get that diploma, and I was able to get an internship with the New Jersey Nets. I actually got my internship through Scott O'Neal, who is now the president of the 76ers, but at the time he was actually selling tickets for the Nets. And we had a mutual friend that knew Scott, and I got my resume to him, and that was kind of how I got my foot in the door. But I didn't get hired until after doing 2 internships back to back. So my first full-time job didn't start until January of '96 in basketball operations, but at a really low level.
So when I was doing some research, I saw that I don't know if this is correct or not, but it said you were a PR intern.
Yeah.
So, one thing I know from talking to different people who have worked in the league is it's hard to move from the business side to the ops side. So how did you get that opportunity?
Well, and it's a lot different than it is today, where basketball operations departments are really big. Back then, I would say basketball operations probably had 10 people, including your coaches and your general manager and your secretary, where I was able to, after I did my internship in PR, I stayed on and did another internship in basketball operations. So that's kind of how I got my foot in the door there, and was basically working for full time and was working for free, which is, that's taboo nowadays, right? People don't like free work, but that's how I really got my foot in the door. It's ironic that I started off in PR, writing press releases and news clips and all that, and now I'm on the media side of things. So I guess it kind of came full circle. But yeah, I mean, my advice is always, though, if you have the opportunity to intern with a team or get your foot in the door with a team, even if it's not something that you want to do, if it's working in marketing or selling tickets, but you want to work in the front office, you just get in somehow, and then you can kind of navigate your way to do. I mean, Eric Spoelstra started as a video coordinator. That was basketball operations. Now he's the head coach of the Heat. Same with, I think, Frank Vogel and with the Lakers. So we've all had to kind of pay our dues somehow from the ground up. And then it's, once you get in, and then it's more about developing relationships and kind of networking.
When you were with the New Jersey Nets at the time in the early years, there were guys like John Calipari and Rod Thorn who were running the team. So what was it like to work under them and have some of those guys as mentors?
Yeah, so Cal came in May of '96. It was a whirlwind. I was fortunate to be able to stay on. I think there was somebody that was going to replace me, but he wound up staying at UMass. So I guess I had like 9 lives there. But Cal was interesting because I was not a manager in college, so I had not gone through that. I played football in college. So I wasn't used to that college mentality of basically being on call 24 hours. And he was coming from UMass. They had just gone to the Final Four. So it was hard to get used to that mentality, but I was living at home. I was young. I could have flexible hours. I didn't have a wife or kids. He was demanding, but he was walking into a situation where we didn't have our own practice facility. We didn't have our own office space for basketball operations. We had a lot of veteran players. We didn't have a young base. So he really had to kind of wipe the slate clean. But working for him, now, I look back on it, he's taught me a lot about certainly time management. That's probably time management, having structure in your life. Rod, came in 2000. And I had not really known Rod Thorn that much, just from him working at the league office for, a long time. And Rod was interesting just because of, my first introduction was during the draft of 2000, and he came in. I've told the story before. He started in May of 2000. And we handed him a book of, scouting reports for him to review over the weekend. And he had called me like the next day, and it wasn't about Kenyon Martin or, some of these other players that he was curious about. It was about like, there was some grammatical errors in it that he was pointing out. So that was my first foray. And I didn't write the scouting reports, but that was my first foray to Rod Thorn. And I worked for Rod for 10 years in the competitive nature of him to be able to, trade for Jason Kidd, draft Kenyon Martin, trade for Richard Jefferson, eventually trade for Vince Carter, go to the playoffs 6 straight years, 2 finals appearances. And that's really kind of when I started to really dive into the salary cap, CBA, the trade front, drafts, kind of how the inner workings of basketball operations work. When I worked for Cal for the 2.5 years, it was kind of all about survival, right? It was like when you have kids, and when you first have kids, it's like survival. It's day to day. And then when Rod came on, I was able to kind of work more in an administrative role.
What are some skills and character traits do you find most needed for someone to be a successful GM or leader in a front office?
Well, I think the first thing is that you need to don't be afraid to delegate, right? I think when you are the head of basketball operations, you are almost the CEO, and your job is to hire people that have specialize in either if it's a salary cap or your performance team or your trainers, or you kind of just filter down there. And if you have the right people in place, I think it makes your job a lot easier. I think if you want to dominate as far as your department, as far as you want to do everything, I think that kind of your shelf life is going to be really, really small here. So I think delegating is probably the first thing. I think the one of the things is that it's important that you don't know everything. That's one of the big things that, from being in the media the last 5 or 6 years, it gave me a kind of a clear picture on when you work for a team, you're really just focused on that team. And then when you work, you have kind of blinders on. When you work in the media, it kind of opens you up to all 30 teams as far as how each of the 30 teams operate here. So that's probably my biggest takeaway from working with the Nets and now being out of it is that, you see the president of basketball operations, then there's a GM, there's a director of scouting, is that you can't be afraid to kind of delegate there.
So how did you, when you got your introduction to the front office for the Nets, how did you get acclimated and kind of, like you've mentioned, teach yourself all of the ins and the outs about the CBA, the salary cap, draft capital, and all of that? How did you familiarize yourself with that?
Study. And it wasn't really about studying the CBA. I wouldn't advise, if there's somebody out there who wants to learn how the collective bargaining agreement works and everything, if you're going to do that and read the CBA, as I call it, it's like Greek, philosophy, right? Like it's a complicated process. And for me, it was studying a little bit of CBA, studying basic. It's a lot of it was trial and error, right? Kind of like circumstances, go through different situations. I mean, I remember back in 2001. We had gotten away from the law firm that was basically writing contracts. So I started to learn how to write contracts. I'm not a lawyer. And we had signed Todd McCulloch to an offer sheet. He was playing in Philadelphia, and taking the train down because I had to give it to the Sixers, as far as, because he was a restricted free agent, and thinking that we had completed an offer sheet, and being on the train coming back in the league office saying, you know what, this was incorrect because of you missed this. And a lot of it is really just kind of trial by error and going through it. So that's kind of how my basis was, really relying on other people, using them as a sponge, and it's 20 years later, and you still never really master it, because there's always something, and it's always changing, right? So you learn the CBA in 2000. Well, in 2005, a new CBA came in. In 2011, another CBA came in. In 2017, another CBA. So it's kind of like getting a baseline of the knowledge. And then each time a CBA comes in, it adds to it. In 2011, the CBA basically, we started from anew. That's when, the hard cap came into play. That's when the repeater tax, like all these different things came in here. But for me, it's really been just trial by error, relying on other people, and then study. And then the best thing is that we have a guy named Larry Kuhn. We call him the godfather of the CBA. He was able to write like an FAQ, they call, of 200 pages. And he basically took the CBA of 700 words and dumbed it down for all of us. And all the teams use it as far as kind of, I call it the Cliff Notes version, as far as what we're able to use. So, even like today, I could be writing an article about Rudy Gobert and Supermax, and I think I know it, right? But I'll need to call a team and say hey, or call the league and be like, hey, just for background, I'm writing this. Is this right? And they'll be like, yeah, it's right. So it's kind of, sometimes it's a reconfirming process of the information you already know.
Going back, you just mentioned that there are multiple CBAs. There's new ones that come in every couple of years. Have there been any rules or parts in the CBA that have been taken out or that are still in that you can remember vividly as something that you didn't necessarily agree with or like, or something that you thought that they added that was good for the league?
Yeah, I mean, probably the amnesty that came in, the amnesty provision, which was in the 2005 CBA, and I think it was in 2011, CBA. We actually used it in New Jersey with Travis Outlaw, who we had signed the year before. I kind of call it the get out of jail free card, right? Like when you make a mistake, it kind of clears your cap. I probably wouldn't agree on that. I don't think you should reward teams for signing players and then be able to wipe. You still have to pay that player, but then you're able to wipe it from your cap. There's been discussions about because of where the revenue is now and what's going to happen in the offseason with the salary cap and the luxury tax. Would the league kind of put an amnesty provision in place for next season and maybe the year after? I don't think they will, but I don't agree that as far as you should be able to kind of wipe the slate clean and get a Blake Griffin type contract off your book, or an Otto Porter type contract off your book. I'll tell you though that some of the things that probably caught me off guard was in 2011 when the CBA came in, and as you know, there's all different exceptions, right? So you have the non-tax mid-level exception, and then you have the tax mid-level, and then you have the room mid-level. And when we were in New Jersey in 2010 and 11, we were never a tax team, right? We were always a team that was always under the cap in 2010 and 11. So we were, you kind of study those rules. What had happened was when we had acquired Darren Williams, and then eventually we signed Darren, and then we made the Joe Johnson trade, and then we signed Gerald Wallace. Then all of a sudden we became a tax team. So when you become a tax team, that limits you to what exception you have, right? So you think you're having the mid-level, and I remember a situation where we'd agreed to sign Mirza Teletovic, and with the full mid-level, and basically if we had done it, it triggers the hard cap, right? So those are kind of things that you kind of, it goes back to trial and error, right? You don't know that until you are in a situation, so you have to go back on. So now it's not the full mid-level. Now it's the tax mid-level. It's we wanted to sign Chris Humphries without triggering the hard cap. So there's all these different nuances as far as until you get in, as I said, get into the situation. You can study as much as you want, but it's the exercise as far as going through it.
I kind of have a two-part question for you. The first part for you is, if you were running a team today, what would be the approach you'd take in building a team? And the second part of the question is, who do you think works the cap really well right now, and who do you think does a poor job of working the cap?
Well, I'll answer your second question first. I mean, I think Andy Ellsberg in Miami is a genius. I really do. I mean, he does not get his due. I mean, maybe he doesn't want any of these jobs that's ever open, but you never hear Andy's name. And I think when you work for the Heat and you work for that culture, you probably never want to leave. Right. I mean, that's plain. Yeah. I mean, what they were able to do last offseason is basically pull the rabbits out of the hat. Right. When you do the Jimmy Butler trade and how complicated that was, The maneuvering that he did in 2010 with LeBron and Wade and Bosh, and then to be able to fit in, I think, Mike Miller and some of the other pieces to rebound when, LeBron left. And I know there was the Olynyk contract and the James Johnson and Deion Waiters. I think when you draft as great as they have with Adebayo and Hero, and then you find Duncan Robinson and Kendrick Nunn, it camouflages some other things. They weren't afraid to take risks. The Dragic trade with Phoenix. So I think Andy does as great a job as far as, managing the cap. I don't think there's anybody that does a poor job. Could there be teams who maybe could structure trades better? Possibly. Could there be teams who could handle how they trade draft picks? Possibly. I'm certainly probably one of those guys as far as looking back at, the Boston trade of 2013, as far as going through that and learning your mistakes there. So I don't want to say there's probably one team or two teams that do a poor job of managing the cap. But as I said, I think Andy does probably as good as a job, as there is there. What was your first question again?
So my first question was, if you were currently running a team right now, how would you build your team with the cap? Or like what strategy would you go about with, one and done's now being a popular thing, with vets getting bigger contracts now than they did 10, 20 years ago. So kind of what would your approach be between building a team around younger talent or veteran talent? What would be the way you kind of go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think building a team now, I think we've kind of gotten away from that big center. I think when you commit a lot of money to the center position, I think that gets you in trouble. Like case in point, like Cleveland, right? So what is Cleveland going to do with Andre Drummond and Tristan Thompson? So that basically, can you afford to have, Drummond's at 28, and can you bring Tristan back at 15? Can you have $43 million committed to your center position? So I think when you look at how teams are constructed, it's interchangeable parts, right? Like guys that can play multiple positions. That's what you want. Where if you have Miami and you have Bam Adebayo, he's not just a post-up guy. He can set screens up top. He can bring the ball up. He can do a lot of great things when you have Iguodala and Crowder. Guys that can play the 3, the 4, the 5 if you need it. I think that's the goal as far as finding those guards. Even Tyler Hero, who's kind of like, hey, he's a shooter, but shoot, Tyler Hero is probably one of the better rebounding guards out there. So I think the first thing is to find interchangeable parts, right? Guys that can play multiple positions there. I think it's easy to say, like, when, hey, we got to focus just on player development, right? Yeah, player development probably gets you 20 wins. I think you have to be careful about that. I think it's important to have a foundation and a baseline. I think teams like Brooklyn were able to do it with, as I call, finding those second chance players, and kind of with Dinwiddie, with Joe Harris, drafting Karis LeVert there. I think if you have a plan in place, if it's a 2 or 3 year plan and you don't skip the steps in doing it, I think you can, find a lot of good things there. I think it's important not to commit money long term unless it is a franchise level all NBA type player. I'm talking, these 4 or 5, 5 years if it's on your team, these 4-year contracts. I think Dallas has done it the right way, where they know that Luka is their franchise player. And now they basically have surrounded him with a lot of role players, but have also given himself the flexibility to have that cap space in 2 years from now or next summer, or be able to move contracts. I think what you don't want to do is have contracts on your books that you can never move, or that you have to always attach something to, because when you do that, it just kind of sends you in this rabbit hole, right? Because then you look up and then you're like, well, I can't trade a first until 2025 now, because you've kept on attaching draft picks. I think you can do that if you've got LeBron on your team and he's going to be committed there for 3 years. I think that's why the AD trade has worked out so great, because you have LeBron on your team. You can give up that amount to New Orleans for AD, because he's likely going to be there, and that shoot, LeBron's going to play in 93% of regular season games. He's not going to miss games right now. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go out and do that. I think you can go, as I say, big game hunting, where you're looking for that next major guy. But if you're going to give up a lot, you better make sure that guy is a franchise level all NBA type player.
Yeah. So one thing I want to touch on is you talked about the 2013 trade, and you also talked about
Yeah.
the Nets currently with Dinwiddie and those guys. One thing that I do know about the trade, or something I've read in the past, is it was almost like 3 different trades in one.
Right.
So what were those negotiations like? And were you looking at any other teams in acquiring other veteran players, or were Pierce and KG kind of those guys that you were only focusing on?
Well, it's funny. So the Pierce, it was really started only as Paul Pierce when you look back on it, and those discussions started around the trade deadline of 2013, and then nothing really manifested, and then we had suffered a really tough series loss to Chicago in 7 games, and in hindsight, Joe Johnson had plantar fasciitis and was playing injured. Brooke broke his foot in game 4 in that triple overtime game. I know Chicago had a bunch of guys out hurt also, and we probably thought we were a lot better than what we were, and we didn't probably take a big picture approach. The Pierce trade, the Boston trade, started as Pierce in I guess early June, and then Garnett didn't really get involved until probably 3 days before the draft, when Doc Rivers left to go to the Clippers. That's really how that kind of started. And the thinking was that with those 2 guys that we would be championship level in 2013-14. We'd have a playoff team for 2 years in 14, 15, 15, 16. And then when the cap spiked in 2016 from TV revenue, we'd be sitting with $70 million in cap space to basically rework our lineup. And in hindsight, we never gave ourselves a safety net. Your margin for error there was none. So when you get to training camp, so when you do the deal and you have to add Keith Bogans in there because he, in a signing trade to make the money work, and Keith got like $5 million to basically do nothing. It was one of the most complicated trades that I've been a part of. Is Marshawn Brooks involved? Is it Reggie Evans involved? Who's it to make the money work? And the deal was agreed upon on the night of the draft, and it didn't happen until the moratorium was lifted 2 weeks later. And then, then you go out and get Karolinko, and you re-sign Andre Bloch, and you have Sean Livingston on that team. And when you look back on it, as I say, your margin, Darren Williams declining. You can't allow Darren Williams to decline in his career. You can't allow not to bring Paul Pierce back. So when it blows up after losing the second round to Miami, now you're looking like, well, wait a minute, we've just traded away the future and we have nothing to show for it. And you don't have that safety net there. So, and that's kind of where it gets you in trouble. Then you're scrambling, right? Then you're trying to make different trades. You're trying to it's like there's holes in the boat, right? All right, how do I you patch up one hole and then another hole opens up and stuff. And what Sean Marks was able to do when they took over in 2000, Sean came in 2016, was he had no ties to the Boston trade, right? Like he came from San Antonio. He could care less. Hey, if Boston is going to get the number 1 pick, who cares? If it's going to be the 3rd pick in the draft, who cares? It doesn't affect us. Where he can start from scratch and he can go out and rely on his scouting department to go out and sign Joe Harris and Spencer Dinwiddie and trade Thaddeus Young for Karis LeVert and do all these different, trade Brooke for D'Angelo Russell and really kind of to build it his own way because his imprints weren't on that Boston trade. So when it turns out to be the number 1 pick in the draft and it's, they trade it to Philly for Jason Tatum, Markelle Fultz. Hey, if we were probably in the front office, that pick would have been the 9th pick in the draft, right? We would have probably been chasing that trade forever. So it worked out in its best way. But yeah, I mean, when you do that type of trade and it's as big as it is, man, you better hope that you have guys on that roster 2 or 3 years from now when those picks come to fruition that, you have something to show for, or you better have a championship under your belt. Like if you win a championship, all is forgotten, right? Like who cares, like if it turns out to the third pick in a draft. But yeah, I mean, we all learned a hard lesson, right? You learn a lesson that what you put on paper is probably not as good as when you kind of go through that trade dynamic in the offseason.
Yeah, so my follow-up with that for you is in the time period where the Nets were struggling after that trade for a few years before Russell and all those guys came in, looking back on it now and seeing the team having two superstars in Kyrie and KD and the Celtics still haven't won a championship, do you think it was that detrimental to the Nets? Looking back on it now, just in terms of where both teams have gone in the last few years and where they're headed?
Well, I mean, Boston wound up getting two good players. I mean, two great. I mean, Jason Tatum's a great player. But the funny thing is, and I always tease with people when I always bring up the Boston trade, is I always say, like, you do realize that Jason Tatum was in 7th grade when we made the trade, and Jaylen Brown was in 8th grade. So it wasn't like we were like, these were like these like LeBron coming out, right? Like you do realize in 2013, like I would be more embarrassed probably if I worked for the Sixers, right? And I flip-flopped 3 for 1 and took Markelle Fultz, and Boston wound up getting Jason Tatum. Like then I would be like, well, wait a minute. Like we knew that what Jason Tatum was kind of coming out of Duke a little bit here. So I think probably what hurt Boston and probably where they were is that, and I don't fault Danny Ainge for it, is that he probably had 2 cracks at getting Kawhi or Anthony Davis, right? But you were going to have to give up a ton to do it. And they may have gotten them championship, but it probably would have cost them Tatum or Brown or draft picks. And I think when you saw what Toronto was able to do when you traded DeMar DeRozan and you traded, a Podol and you traded a draft picks and stuff like that, where they were saying like, you know what, we're going to go all in here with Kawhi for a year. We don't know what's going to happen. And if we win a championship and he leaves, it was all worth it, right? Like it was all worth it. And the same with Rob Pelinka and the Lakers with AD. Like if this thing implodes or if we win a championship and AD wants to go in somewhere else, it was all worth it here. So that's the game of taking risks, like to get these guys, to get Kawhi Leonard or Anthony Davis, it's all about risks. And, I don't fault Danny because there was no commitment for neither of these guys probably would have signed long term. And if you lose in the second round, then it's egg on their face. But with Brooklyn, like what Sean's been able to do is that he created a foundation. So when Kyrie and Kevin were free agents, they can say like they don't have to give up anything for us to come here. Like most, when the Knicks acquired Carmelo Anthony in 2011, they had to trade everyone for Carmelo. And you're basically left with Amari and like role players here, where with Kevin and Kyrie, they said like they're in Brooklyn, like we could be really good with Karras and Spencer and Jared Allen, Joe Harris. We got DeAndre Jordan now. We've got our draft picks back. There's a strong foundation where they can just slide in there. So on paper they look great, So I think it's two different stories with the Boston trade. I think Boston they certainly had more success than Brooklyn. They started, back in 2015 with Isaiah, and then they got Kyrie. So they've been that perennial playoff team, second round or Eastern Conference Finals for the last 3 or 4 years, where Brooklyn's got the star power. Now it's all a matter of if they can stay healthy and kind of if they can, mesh on the court.
So a trade that I wanted to backtrack to, speaking of risks and gambles, the Bulls had the 11th pick in the 2014 draft, and they picked Doug McDermott, technically not. They traded Gary Harris and Yusuf Nurkic for their rights to Doug McDermott. I'm wondering, looking back at that now, you see the Nuggets and they got rid of Nurkic, but they still have Harris, who's a great player. And you see someone like Doug McDermott, who hasn't necessarily lived up to the hype that he deserved coming out of college, being a top 5 all-time scorer.
Yeah.
What was your read on that deal when it happened? And obviously people see the results of it today, but at the time, was it a good move, or was it just one of those where it was mismanagement of assets?
Yeah, I always say it's the quality over quantity trade, right? So when you have, I think they had 15, 15 and 19, right? Chicago had that year.
It was 16 and 19, yeah.
16 and 19, right? So like, where is Doug McDermott on your draft board, right? That's probably how it all started. So every team has a draft board, 1 to 60. So let's say they had Doug McDermott like 7 on their board. I don't know. I'm just talking out loud here, where you're saying like, well, we've got 16 and 19. How do we get up to get Doug McDermott? How do we? So that's on your scouting department, right? Maybe they don't view Nurkic or Gary Harris, as valuable as Denver did. So that's A, I guess, missed opportunity. B, then you have kind of the rotating door of coaches, right? You have kind of, I think Fred was there, right? As far as maybe, Doug McDermott fit in a lot better in Indiana than he probably did in Chicago for those 2 years. So, yeah, I mean, that's the hard thing, as far as when you have multiple picks, right? And you want to move up and grab a guy, then you go out and do it. If you think he's he's high on your draft board. So then you are relying on your scouting department. I mean, that's the big thing. And how does that player fit in with, if it's Fred Hoiberg, how does he fit in with your system? And, it's funny, like people are talking about Tyler Hero right now and how great he's playing. And I've heard, Boston, they let out a moan because Miami took him at 13 and they're sitting there at 14, right? And I say, like, well, if you have Tyler Hero that high on your board, then you package those picks and you move up, right? So you move up to 12 to Charlotte, or you move up to 11 and you take 14 and 23 and see what you can do. So, but it's all about, I think it's all about how you have them on your draft board. I think, if you put an X on that or a missed market, then probably more on your scouting department.
So staying on the trade talk, with your time at the Nets, are there any deals that you were really close to completing or going through with that you just never pulled the trigger on? Or are you able to talk about those at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, we chased Carmelo Anthony for 6 months, from Labor Day of 2010 until the trade deadline of 2011. Between us and the Knicks, that was kind of a back and forth. I thought that we had gone down the path where we were really close to getting Carmelo multiple times here. We had a lot of draft picks that we had stored up. I think we had 3 from other teams. We had traded Terrence Williams, who from Louisville, who we had drafted a couple years ago. We wound up getting, 2 firsts, from him, 1 from the Lakers, 1 from Houston. So we had the assets to go about doing the deal. New York wound up coming in with a better package. So, and then we wound up trading for Darren Williams the next day. So I thought we were close on that. I certainly thought we were close on getting Dwight Howard, which was right when the lockout was lifted in 2011. That went on for 2 or 3 months with Orlando. The conversations back then, the trade deadline was in March because the season was postponed. And what happened was Dwight was supposed to opt out of his contract and wound up opting in the day of the trade deadline. And the Magic had no leverage. They didn't need to trade him. Dwight had lost his leverage. So that kind of had gotten thrown out of, that trade. One funny story is that, so yeah, those 2 deals were pretty close. One funny story, and this pertains to the Bulls. They had it one year, I think it was the year they took Luell, and they maybe had 2 picks in that year. I think they had maybe the 3rd pick or and they had a pick in the teens, let's say. Maybe it was when the year LaMarcus was drafted by Portland. That, one of those years. But so they had the 3rd pick in the draft or the 2nd pick in the draft and like pick 16, let's say. And they had called us and they said, "Hey, we're interested in trading the 2nd pick for player X and a draft pick. And we were like, well, shoot, yeah, like we want to do that. That's a good deal for us, And we talk about it as a group, and we say, yeah, we're gonna do it. So around 6:00 the night of the draft, we call Chicago and said, yeah, we're in. Okay, and they said, okay, we'll call you right before the draft starts. So right before the draft says, okay, what are we gonna do here? Clock started, and they said, wait a minute, we're not trading you the second pick. We're trading you our first round pick. It wasn't pick number 2. It was pick 17 in the draft. And we were like, what? We're not doing that. So so that's and that's kind of like the misinterpretation, right? Like, remember 2 years ago when Washington and Memphis made it was the Brooks trade, right?
Yeah.
It was that, like what Brooks is it? Is it Marshawn?
Yeah.
Is it Dylan? And they're like, yeah, it's like those are like sometimes you kind of get misconstrued there. It's a funny story with the second. Hey, we're like doing cartwheels. We're gonna get the second pick in the draft. We're gonna take LaMarcus Aldridge, and stuff. And I want to be like, no, it's the second first round pick. It's like pick 17 there.